Well, good evening and welcome to this webinar event in our school civic discourse project. This is the second in our series this academic year on race, justice, and leadership in America. I'm Paul Carisse. I'm the director of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership here at Arizona State University. And tonight we're delighted to be joined by Professor Randall Kennedy of Harvard Law School to discuss his views on race, social justice, and higher education today. How racist are universities really? Part of our school's mission is to promote civic dialogue about pressing issues of our time. And each academic year, our speaker series, the Civic Discourse Project, extends the conversations and debates of our classrooms to a broader community. Arizona PBS records those speaker events and broadcasts them. You can visit our website to see all of our previous lectures and speaker events in the Civic Discourse Project. That's at scetl.asu.edu. Given the public health crisis this summer, we developed a new series, the Pandemic Dialogues of webinars. And given the events and intensive debates since this summer on race and social justice, we developed this new series on race, justice, and leadership in America to provide room for discussion of fundamental American principles in relation to current discourse. Again, more information on our school as a whole, all our programs, and also the Civic Discourse Project is at our website, scetl.asu.edu. We'll have two main parts to tonight's webinar. First, I'll pose questions to our guest, Professor Kennedy, focused on an essay published this summer in the Chronicle of Higher Education. Then in the second part, we'll have a Q&A session from the virtual community that is joining us, although we'll start with a special guest questioner who I'll introduce in a moment. So if you're interested in posing questions, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we'll get to those in the last about 20 minutes of our webinar tonight. Our colleague, Dr. Carol McNamara, is going to be collecting those questions behind the scenes and directing them to me and to our special guest to pose to Professor Kennedy. So now to our special guest, Randall Kennedy is the Michael R. Klein Professor at Harvard Law School, where he teaches courses on contracts, criminal law, and the regulation of race relations. He was born in Columbia, South Carolina. He's a graduate of Princeton University, Oxford University, where he studied as a Rhodes Scholar, and Yale Law School. He served as a law clerk for Judge J. Skelly Wright of the United States Court of Appeals and for Justice Thurgood Marshall of the United States Supreme Court. Professor Kennedy is a member of the Bar of the District of Columbia and the Bar of the Supreme Court of the United States. He was awarded the 1998 Robert F. Kennedy Book Award for his book, Race, Crime, and the Law. He also writes for a wide range of scholarly and general interest publications. I'll list just a few of his other books: For Discrimination, Race, Affirmative Action, and the Law; The Persistence of the Color Line, Racial Politics and the Obama Presidency; Interracial Intimacies, Sex, Marriage, Identity, and Adoption; and Nigger, The Strange Career of a Troublesome Word. Professor Kennedy is a member of the American Law Institute, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Association. He also is a trustee emeritus of Princeton University. So Professor Kennedy, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I'll introduce your very interesting essay in the Chronicle by saying it begins with praise for the recent upsurge of activism against and renewed debate about racial inequity in America, debates about how to redress current and past racial wrongs, and you praise this for debate going on both in the country at large and in universities. But most of your essay focuses on concerns you have about some of the recent arguments for reforms in higher education. So to begin with, you argue that proponents of anti-racism measures should be more careful about charges of systemic racism toward a given university or college. Particularly, it's not always fair or accurate to conclude that systemic racism is the cause of the small proportion of Blacks on university faculty or in the leadership. So could you begin by explaining further your main argument and the element you bring in that this may be more of a pipeline issue or shape of the river issue than any question of systemic racism?
Sure. Again, thank you very much for this forum. You're quite correct that I begin my essay, and I'm going to begin my remarks here by applauding those who are insisting that all of our institutions grapple with the problem of racism in American life. Racism is all too prevalent. It's all too powerful. We've seen that in lots of different ways. We've seen a person go birding in the middle of New York City and confront racism in an atrocious form, a form that could be a quite dangerous form. So I'm glad that people are shining a light and are lifting their voices and are insisting that we do more to try to deal with this problem that has been so central and is so deeply embedded in American life. It's precisely because it is so central, it's precisely because it is so important that we need to be careful in our analysis of this problem. We need to be careful. We need to be as precise as we can. And attribution matters a lot. So if we're talking about higher education, one of the great tragedies of American life is that if we just focus for a moment on, let's just African Americans, the fact of the matter is that people who are able to get to any institution of higher education, that person is doing pretty well. Most people don't get that far. Most people are cut back, are cut down, are held back by lack of educational resources, lack of health resources, absence of living in dangerous places. There are so many things that cut people down before they even have a decent chance of getting anywhere near higher education. So we need to be aware of that. And when we're talking about the race question and higher education and education more generally, we have to be aware that we're talking about a big problem that's confronting people in lots of different ways. So what I mean by attribution, if we're talking about higher education, and we're talking about the dearth of Black people who are students, the dearth of Black people who are professors, that's all too true many places. The problem, however, might not be the university, because after all, by the time you get to the university, a lot has happened. Like I said, a lot of people have been cut down before then. And so it's not, I don't think it's helpful to speak as if everything that shows up at the university level is the university's fault. There's a lot that has happened that unfortunately prevents as many Black people as being in our institutions of higher education as there should be, as we'd like to see.
One of the issues you address is, as you well know, a legal and constitutional question. For lay people, it's something of a philosophical issue, which is you're using the language here of attribution. It's to sort out the difference between, on the one hand, disparate impact or differing results by racial identity or by other identities. That's on the one hand, and whether there is a racist cause in this case for those differing results and differential impacts. That would be a larger societal question. But then in the specific context of higher education, it's more complicated to trace and to make the argument that the higher education institution itself has been racist, or that there could be this concept of systemic racism occurring.
Yeah, I mean, listen, again, I want to repeat, I'm glad that people are really concerned about the specter, the threat of racism. And there's a good reason for people to be concerned about that in any institution, frankly, any institution, given the history of racism in American life. But again, we have to be careful. So if one takes a look, for instance, and says, gosh, in this department of, let's say, physics, there are so few Black professors. What do we make of that? Well, do we make of that the university is discriminating against people who, against Black people who might be professors of physics? Could it be? It could be. And if that's true, if that's the case, say it. And if that's shown to be the case, that needs to be rectified. At the same time, we have to be open to the following proposition. We have to be open to the proposition that the reason why there are so few in a department of physics, in a department of astronomy, in a department of mathematics, is because, to use your words, of a pipeline problem. There are, unfortunately, because of things which we should know about, because of, again, lack of educational resources, because of incarceration, because of vulnerability to violence, because of, and one could go on and on and on, so many Black youngsters are cut down, are stunted before they can even be plausible candidates for higher education or plausible candidates to be professors. And so what I'm saying to folks is, listen, let's make sure that we are directing our fire where the problem really is. And in my experience, the problem really is places that are really outside of the universities.
Yeah, I use the rather inelegant term pipeline, but you cite a book published some time ago by a former president of Harvard and former president of Princeton called The Shape of the River,
Yes.
arguing for affirmative action measures of various kinds prior to people arriving in higher education. So another point that you raise is that care is needed among advocates for racial justice so as to be fair to their own university communities and college communities, but also in order to maintain credibility and build alliances in order to undertake what measures would be appropriate to redress past racial injustices. And you also note that part of the credibility issue is that some kinds of rhetoric that you call hyperbolic rhetoric about systemic racism give an easy opening to some conservatives or some critics who want to focus on unfairness or opportunism. So could you discuss that concern? Because you also mentioned that higher education itself, like everything else in America, has become a polemical or a polarized issue in our discourse.
Yeah, I mean, it's an old story, the cry wolf story. I mean, the fact of the matter is, one needs to be careful in what one says. If an institution warrants indictment, fine, indict, but make sure that you've got the evidence to make out your case, because if you're constantly using words, important words, racism is an important word, that is a terrible thing. If you say that an institution is, pervasively racist, well, that's a heck of a claim to make. If it's true, make it. On the other hand, if you make that sort of argument in a loose way, in a gratuitous way, after a while, people are not going to be taking that seriously. And I fear that to be the case sometimes, that people are using language very loosely. They're not using language carefully enough, and this is a serious subject. Also, there's the problem of misleading people. So it may sometimes I think people engage in strategic hyperbole. They exaggerate, but they exaggerate on purpose. And they assume that their audience sort of knows that they're exaggerating. Well, sometimes that's so, but there's audiences. When members of faculties and when administrators are arguing about these things, whether they're face-to-face or whether they're in print, there's a large audience, and some of the people in the audiences are students. So I've had the following happen. I've had students come up to me, Black students, ask me, well, Professor Kennedy, I'm interested in a career in academia, but I've read that I won't be given a fair shot. I'm worried about going into academia. What do you think? And I tell people straight away, I say, listen, I've been in academia for 36 years. Is it heaven on earth? No, it's not heaven on earth, but I mean, there is no heaven on earth. But my sense is that actually you will be given a fair shot. And with respect to, in American life, there are problems everywhere, but I will say this about the university system. I will say this about colleges and universities and higher education in general. Across American life, I think that higher education is a place that is actually among the most open, most attentive to trying to nurture talent, recognize talent, advance the interests of people who have been marginalized. I think that needs to be said, and I don't make any apologies about saying it, because I want people who've been marginalized to come into not just legal academia, all of academia. And if you just keep telling people, and I think wrongly, that academia is just pervasively racist. Well, I mean, if it's pervasively racist, why would somebody want to go into that? Maybe they'll go into something else. I don't think that's the case. And I don't want people to be misled.
Another related dimension to this that occurred in the wake of your article was that you're a little tough on your alma mater, Princeton, but you've also served your alma mater as an emeritus, as a trustee, and now you're an emeritus trustee. But as it turns out, in the month or so after your essay was published in the Chronicle of Higher Education, and in the wake of some statements that the Princeton University president had made about systemic racism, some of what you predicted as possibly occurring did occur, that a conservative critic of higher education, in this case, President Trump, and the Department of Education, announced to Princeton that they wanted to open up an inquiry. Because if the president of the university is saying that Princeton has been pervasively systemically racist and still is, then how can they have filed all these reports year after year, required under civil rights legislation from the 1960s, to say that they do not discriminate on the basis of color? We talked about it, an article written by Connor Friedersdorf in The Atlantic about this. Friedersdorf is very critical of the Trump administration for opening up this investigation, but he does cite you for saying, well, there is a warning here about strategic hyperbole by advocates of affirmative action or remedying past wrongs.
Again, I think people have to be careful with their language. I think that people simply, let's just be clear, let's just be precise, and let's not say things that can allow us to be hoisted on our own petards. I mean, I think that let's just be clear. This is so serious that we should, I think that everybody needs to cut out the sloganeering. Let's just be careful and methodical about what we have to say. And you mentioned, yes, I was on the board of trustees of Princeton University, and I will say this. There was a time when, that's right, I was on the board. If you're on a board of trustees, you are part of the group that governs the university. Well, if you're part of the group that governs the university, and there are faculty members or anybody, frankly, who says that this institution is pervasively racist, as far as I'm concerned, that implicates me. That implicates me. I was on the board of trustees of Princeton University for a good long time, well over a decade. And no, I would not be part of an institution that was pervasively racist. So I take this, actually, quite personally. And I think that people in the university system, including professors, by the way, if you're a professor at an institution, you can go other places. You can go other places. You mean to tell me that you would invest your time and energy in a place that was pervasively racist? No, I don't. I think that people need to really take this on board, take responsibility. If you are part of such an institution, call it out and take action. I would expect to see people resign. I would expect to see people leave. I'm not going to invest my energies, my talents in an institution that's racist. And so again, I'm just asking people to be clear. If it's unclear to you, if it's uncertain, if it's ambiguous, say it's ambiguous. There's nothing wrong with that. It's ambiguous. I don't know. I have suspicions. Why do we have to, talk in such, it's either this or it's this, and talk so broadly? There are a lot of things, an institution has some good parts. It has some parts that need work. Why not have a more complex palette in which we try to portray the complexity of social life, because we know that it's complex. We know that in our institutions, there are really good aspects of our institutions. There are sometimes bad aspects of our institutions. There's a lot in the middle. There are things that are changing all of the time. It seems to me that this is the language with which we need to speak, and cut out the language that's, just overdrawn.
I do want to ask you about your view of where to go from here. But before we get to that question, your article also mentions one other thing to avoid, which, and you specifically look at Princeton, that higher education leaders or institutional leaders should avoid proposing mechanisms and remedies that would be particularly divisive within a university community, especially those that might pretty obviously infringe on academic freedom of faculty or of departments, by suggesting that there be university-wide review committees to assess, I don't know, a professor's research or a course or some other kind of curriculum. Is it racist? Is it properly anti-racist, et cetera? And you have a very strong criticism of anything like that approach. Would you talk about that for a moment?
I certainly do. You made reference to my article. My article was prompted by a letter to the authorities at Princeton, and part of the letter had to do with a critique of Princeton that I thought was just exaggerated. The idea that Princeton was pervasively racist as an institution, which I think is just demonstrably untrue. But there was also a part of the letter that gave various demands. There was a long list of demands, and one of the demands was for a committee that would investigate and, if necessary, discipline people who were engaged in racist teaching or racist research or racist publications. And I must say, of all of the demands, and there were a number that I thought were problematic, but this is the one that just leapt off the page for me. University life, I think, is wonderful, and one of the great things about university life is its openness, pluralism. Yes, there are going to be people who are going to disagree. They're going to disagree fundamentally. That's what university life should be about. The idea of setting up some committee to be looking over people's shoulders and I guess examining what they're writing and determining whether it's racist or not, it seems to me that that would put a terrible chill into any university committee community, and I'm totally against that. And by the way, I'm another thing. I mean, at a lot of places, the idea of, I think we have to be very careful about, sort of training people. The idea that everybody has to go to this, and we're going to give you a test to see if you have learned such and such. Well, just suppose I disagree. What about that? It's not that, I disagree with your answer to that question. I think we have to be really quite clear and really lay down some markers with respect to the issue of freedom of expression, freedom of thought. That is the heart of university life. And anything that trenches on that is a big problem. And yes, you're correct. That was a big part of what I had to say. And it's a big part of my thinking about the variety of issues that confront higher education. At the heart of higher education must be freedom of thought. Anything that trenches on that is, it seems to me, a threat to scholarly life and a threat to intellectual life.
Thank you. So my final question before we turn to our special first questioner from the audience is to ask about what some specific steps you think now, just in general, about higher education. A great strength, I thought, of your essay is that universities and colleges do need to be assessed case by case, right? Particularly, but in general, you've written in favor of racial affirmative action in the higher education. You raised the shape of the river or the pipeline issue, citing statistics from the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education. So what steps do you think colleges and universities, constructive steps, should they be considering right now to address concerns with racial inequities or the shape of the river?
I think that higher education has to be concerned with a problem. It's a racial problem. It's a class problem. The problem of inequity. The problem of, we have higher education and so many people are precluded from enjoying higher education. Either, sometimes it's affordability. Sometimes it's simply people not being prepared to take advantage of higher education. And to the extent that universities can do something about that, they ought to. I want to be cautious here, though, because universities can't do everything. Universities have a place in society. They do certain things. And we have, by the way, a wide range of universities. That's one of it's a great aspect, actually, of American life. We have a wide range of universities that do a wide range of different things. That's all to the good. We should not impose on our universities missions that, frankly, they are incapable of accomplishing. I think that universities can do what they can do to be more open, to be more accessible to more people. I think that universities ought to constantly be examining themselves. Are we, for the selective universities, is our mode of selectivity a justifiable mode of selectivity, or is it not? For other sorts of universities, are there ways that we could be educating people in a better way, a better form? What about our curriculum? What about our curriculum? Are we teaching people what they ought to know in 2020? These are questions that it seems to me that our university leaders and our faculty members and administrators These are the sorts of questions that it seems to me they ought to be asked.
And that, by that you mean the higher education curriculum?
Yes, absolutely. A higher education curriculum. Again, universities can't handle everything. You know, we have a big society. There's stuff that universities can't handle. And I think it'd be a mistake for a university to try to do what it cannot do. The university is set up to do certain things, do that, and do that well. And hope that there'll be other agencies in our society that can take up the slack and that address things that universities cannot address. Finally, before we go further, I want to emphasize something. I think that again, sometimes institutions can fail by not standing up for themselves and for not showing enough confidence in what they do. And frankly, I think I see a little bit of that in the universities. I don't think that the university leaders have actually responded as well as they might to some of the allegations that get thrown their way. If your university is being charged with, something really quite terrible, and it's not true, it seems to me that you should say that. You should say that publicly so that everybody knows it. Now, again, I'm not saying that the university is perfect. In fact, university may be deficient in, A, B, C to Z. But if a university is being charged with acting in a way, frankly, that is profoundly antisocial, and that's not true, it seems to me that the university officials should come forth and publicly say, no, we have our problems. And by the way, and let me tell you what some of our problems are. Let me tell you what some of our deficiencies are. We're not afraid to, say that we're deficient in certain ways. But with respect to this claim, no, this claim is demonstrably, inaccurate. I think that universities need to stand up for themselves and show more confidence in what they do, confident enough to actually defend themselves.
And one of the difficult circumstances for universities that only so much they can do is that from the 1960s onward, and even the text of the 14th Amendment, there is an argument to be had about whether our civil rights laws and our Reconstruction amendments propose a colorblind ideal, and you've written a lot about this, or to what degree racial affirmative action is justified. But universities can't just do whatever they want in admissions or in hiring, because they operate in a legal context where some of these questions are still unsettled and difficult and contentious.
True, of course, universities are highly regulated. They are, not just in the racial area, but in lots of different ways. And so that's right, universities can't just do whatever they want. Again, I think that university leaders should let's just be straightforward. That's all I'm saying. Let's be straightforward. Let's be clear. Let's not underplay, but let's not overplay. Let us be serious people dealing with serious problems.
Well, great. So now we have time for audience Q&A, and I want to remind everyone who's with us to please use the Q&A function in Zoom to pose questions. And now I'd like to introduce our special first questioner from the floor, who actually will join me in posing questions to Professor Kennedy as we move on. So our guest is Stanley James, who is the Vice Provost for Inclusion and Community Engagement in the Office of the University Provost here at ASU. And she will now pose a few questions to Professor Kennedy to complete our conversation. Professor James holds a joint appointment in the African and African American Studies and the Women and Gender Studies programs in ASU's School of Social Transformation. Her areas of teaching and research include women's international human rights and Black feminisms. I'll mention just some of her publications. She's co-edited 3 anthologies including Still Brave, The Evolution of Black Women's Studies. That's with Frances Foster and Beverly Guy Sheftall. And with Abena Bouzia, Theorizing Black Feminisms, The Visionary Pragmatism of Black Women. Most recently with Ali Tripp, she has co-edited an award-winning series entitled Women in Africa and the Diaspora for the University of Wisconsin Press. Stanley, thanks very much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Kennedy. We're delighted to have you with us tonight. I've been aware of your work and very impressed with the work that you do. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. I do want to think about some things that you have said in your article and some questions that arose when I was listening to your responses to Paul. I think that I had the opportunity to go back and actually read the demands that were put forth by the Princeton faculty and a number of other things as well. But one of the things that occurs to me, and I'm wondering, have you thought about it in this way? I kind of saw this as a manifesto in sort of almost in the tradition of the 1960s, in the sense that I did not assume that everything that was in the document was expected to happen immediately. What I thought was that the writers of, or the people that, well, the people that wrote and the people that signed this, and those are not always the same thing, we're putting out there things that were open for discussion. And the assumption was that not all of these things would happen, but that there would be discussions around most of them, and that they would come to some understandings about what should or should not be the way that Princeton chooses to go ahead in this. So as I listened to you, I wondered, was there anything in this document that you, of initiatives that you feel comfortable in supporting? I did not get that from your article.
Yeah, I think, thank you for that question. To tell you the truth, and so I am a person who has supported strongly, progressive politics, strongly for affirmative action. I put myself as a person on the political left. Yet this manifesto, frankly, has alienated me.
Okay.
Now, I mean, that's just, yes, I found it very off-putting. And I'm thinking to myself, gosh, if this manifesto was off-putting to me with, my political orientation, what is its effect going to be on other people? By the way, one of my favorite historians, it was a man named Richard Hofstadter, wonderful historian, Richard Hofstadter. And Richard Hofstadter once said that any good point should be able to bear the burden of overstatement. So I'm not even demanding, I understand that sometimes you've got to overshoot to sort of get on the map. You've got to raise your voice to be heard. You got, there is a place for drama. So I'm not saying, gosh, don't be dramatic. I'm not saying don't raise your voice. I'm not saying that don't shake the tree. Sometimes you got to shake the tree really hard. But are you saying things which are going to, I don't know, alienate your, people who should be your natural allies?
Mhm.
Are you going to say things which, as far as I'm concerned, I bet that there are people who are reading these things. I bet that there are people on the faculty at Princeton and elsewhere, because, you know, all of our institutions, it's not like something happens at your institution and I don't know about it.
Mhm.
I read about your institution, you read about my institution. All these institutions are part of a higher education network.
Mhm.
Is it the case that you're saying things, and it may very well be that people don't say anything about it? They don't protest, they don't write about it, but they are saying to themselves, oh my goodness, you know, this isn't serious. I'm not gonna even take this seriously. It makes them roll their eyeballs and they don't take it seriously.
Mhm.
I think that that is part of, we won't know for a while, but my suspicion
Mhm.
is that that is one of the upshots of the manifesto at Princeton. And by the way, there were manifestos at a lot of different places, as you well know.
Yeah, I've read Dartmouth's and University of Chicago, and the Catholic institutions have, you know, African American studies
Yes.
put them out. So this is not unusual. I think that one of the other things that I wanted to ask, to be, you know, to, I guess you could say, needle you a little bit.
Fine, please.
Um, so I began to wonder what would happen if we began our discussions based on the premise that structural racism does indeed exist, and that it has been responsible for untold damage um, in our institutions, not just our institutions of education, but in general. And if we begin to operate, if that was the case, instead of the usual fallback about I'm not racist because,
Mhm.
you know, and I think that one of the things that seems to be real, that may be helpful in us taking that stance, is to recognize that structural racism does not only harm people of color,
Mhm.
but it actually is harming the dominant group as well.
Mhm.
And there's very little conversation about that. Now, just
Professor James, I embrace that your proposition. I totally embrace that. And in fact, the irony is, I don't think that I think that the writers of the manifesto, though at one level they rhetorically sound radical, I don't think they're radical enough in the following way. They you know, they sort of begin with racist society, and then they're talking about Princeton University and who's on the faculty of Princeton University. Princeton University is a small place, very elite place. The fact of the matter is, most people, it's so elite. We're not talking about many people. And it seems to me, if we are truly going to be serious about the problem of racism in America, let's talk about racism in America. Definitely. We have huge problems. The question of whether you've got 3 or whether you've got 5 professors at Princeton University is way down the line as far as, you know, problems that beset Black America.
yes, it is. And
What
it
about
is.
all of the kids? What about all of the kids who don't even come, who are not plausible candidates for any institution of higher education? We need to be doing something about them. It's not that, again, I'm not letting any institution off the hook, but we do need to have a sense of perspective. We do need to have a sense of, you know, where are the major problems? And I'm simply saying, as far as this manifesto goes, they were speaking as if what they were talking about was a major problem of African-American life. And I'm simply saying, oh, no. Frankly, we would be in a better position if they were right. If they were right, we would be in a much better position. Our situation is actually much more dire than that manifesto suggested. And that's why I say I think that they were actually, you know, sort of directing fire at places. I don't want the fire. I don't, you know, there's bigger fish for us to fry. One other thing, because I know other questions are coming.
I know.
You know, and it gets this freedom of expression issue, because this is a big one for me, a real big one. You know, one thing that has been forgotten, when people talk about freedom of expression and due process and those sorts of things on campus, you know, people have forgotten, if they ever knew. Ask the following question: who were the students that brought federal constitutional rights to public institutions of higher education? You know who were the students who did that? Black students in the South. The seminal case, Dixon versus Alabama State College. It was Black students in the Second Reconstruction who demanded, they were protesting, they were writing in their school newspapers, they were being thrown out of school. They were the ones who demanded, and rightfully so, they were demanding freedom of expression, freedom of thought on campus. And the reason why I say this is because in all too many instances now, I get into discussions, and it's people who are, you know, the champions of social justice, sort of, as far as I can tell, sort of demean and diminish claims of freedom of conscience, freedom of expression. And what I want to say to people is these two, over the course of American history, it's usually been the freedoms of people who were the champions of social justice marching arm in arm with the champions of freedom of expression, with the people who were championing freedoms of conscience. I think that can be the same way today, and we should be watchful for anything that limits freedom of expression, freedom of conscience. I think that people who are keenly attuned to social justice need to be very keenly attuned to those liberties as well. They usually go together.
Of course, I can ask you so many more questions, but I have a feeling that Paul is getting ready to say no. Let's open it up to everybody else. But
Thank you so much.
I'm sure, Stanley, you've got a good question that has popped up in your queue. I'm going to start with one that takes up from that last conversation that you and Randy Kennedy had, which is from an audience member asking about your statement earlier, saying that equity mechanisms such as diversity statements or racial equity audits or diversity, equity, inclusion trainings, et cetera, that those could endanger freedom of thought or academic freedom. And this questioner says, isn't that too strong a binary? You yourself are asking for more nuanced thinking about these complicated questions. So I'll be a little sharper than the questioner. Is this a false choice that you've put? Couldn't you have some of these training and diversity, equity, inclusion mechanisms and audits while protecting freedom of expression? Okay,
I'll go with that amendment. Maybe I did speak too broadly. No, I mean, I'm serious. I mean, we're talking, we're having a conversation. One of the good things about a conversation, you say something, maybe upon being challenged, you think about it, and maybe it was, too broadly put. So no, I'm not saying that it's necessarily a bad thing for, let's say, students, especially when they're entering an institution. There are a lot of institutions that have, we're going to have a common read. We're going to all read a book. We're all going to discuss it. Fine. Do I think that that's necessarily an intrusion? No, no. I mean, we're educators, we're learning. So no, so I think a lot has to do with how it's handled. So no, I'm not saying as a matter of principle that, let's say diversity training is as a matter of principle problematic, as a matter of principle, a bad thing. No, I wouldn't say that. And if I suggested that before, I rescind. I was wrong. So let me restate it. I don't want anything that is going to encroach on freedom of expression, freedom of thought. If one has a program, make sure that those bad things don't happen. So if we're going to have a program, we're going to have, candid discussion, let's have candid discussion. Let's have open discussion. And if we can, and let's do that. What let's not have, I guess what was sort of in my mind, I mean, I have been in settings in which you have the sort of the moderator, you have the person who is running the show, and they run the show in a way that is in rhetoric open, but the logic of it, frankly, is quite dictatorial. And that I don't like. That I see as a problem in our scholastic life, our intellectual life. It's that I was complaining about.
Okay. Stanley, have you got a question posed by the audience?
I think so. I'll just read it to you, and then you can take it from there. It says, in what ways do you recommend that educational institutions initiate change to create a more equitable foundation? There are so many programs out there to help people from disadvantaged backgrounds, but it remains a major problem. Why is that? Are there reforms to the public education sector that you think would make a difference?
Oh yeah, I mean, listen, the fact of the matter is that in too many parts of our country, tragically, people, wide swaths of our population of young people go to schools in which they are not getting the educations that they deserve. They are not getting the support they deserve. Early on, I'm talking 3, 4, 5 years old. By the time somebody is, 11th grade, 12th grade, 11th grade or 12th grade is pretty advanced. I mean, you're demanding, your institution is demanding a lot of people by the time they hit the 12th grade. What happens to somebody who has not learned the basics of exposition, and then they want to get access to higher education? So what I'm saying, I think that our institutions of higher education, the first and most important thing that our institutions of higher education need to do is tend to what they do best, what they are designed to do, which is teach students what they need to know given the sort of institutions that we have. That's what institutions of higher education, that's their first job. That is their first job. And I don't think that institutions of higher education can go back to first grade, second grade, third grade, kindergarten. What we need, we need the agencies that, the educational agencies that tend to kindergarten, first grade, second grade on up. They need to be better supported. They need to, there are many things. Teaching is a very difficult enterprise. And across the United States, it's quite clear that our teachers are not getting, the compensation, the other sorts of support. It's quite clear that public education, by the way, public education in general, not only public education at the primary school level, the secondary school level, look at what has happened with public education in our institutions of higher education. Over the past 20 years, there has been a tremendous drop in public support of all of our institutions of education, and all of them, that needs to be remedied at every level. Those are some of the things that we need to do. And, can universities do that on their own? No, they can't do that on their own. They're going to need the support of legislatures. They're going to need the support of governors. They're going to need the support of donors. They're going to need the support of alumni. We need to recognize that higher education in the United States has been a tremendous boon, a tremendous benefit to our country at every level. If we're talking about race, if we're talking about gender, just across the board, it is a precious asset, and we need to protect that precious asset. And in fact, not just protect it, but nurture it. And I think we need to be very outspoken about that. Because if we do not protect our institutions of higher education and education in general, we will regret it.
Let me just jump in and say one thing about that. I spent many years at the University of Wisconsin, and one of the things that they were known for was the Wisconsin idea, which was that the university was responsible for the education being dispersed to the walls of the state it began with, but then later to the nation and then the world and beyond. And it came under siege, as you mentioned, with the state government. When prior to that, there had been a partnership between the state and the university. The university helped with drafting policies. They helped with all kinds of things that needed to be done, that the state needed to do. But we have found that was under siege. There was even an effort to take it out.
Yes.
And people came up to say things about that. That is an example of what you're talking about. But I think what you're talking about is certainly not limited to Wisconsin. It is going across it's happening all over the country.
Absolutely. And take a look at what's happening to our institutions of higher education. They are being attacked on various fronts. On one front, they're being attacked as, sort of liberal, ultra liberal elitism. And why are we spending our tax dollars on these ultra liberal elitists who are looking down their noses at us? That's one line of attack. That's one line of attack that's out there. We all know it. And then the other line of attack is what I was responding to, which is people saying, these institutions are, suffused by racism. Well, hold it. I mean, what? At the same time, they're being attacked. And it seems to me that in both instances, we have folks who are exaggerating. They are exaggerating. They are being demagogic. And the loser in the arena of public opinion are our universities. And that's why it seems to me that we university people need to stand up. We don't need to be defensive. We don't need, let's not, no, it's not like we are always right. It's not like we're doing everything right. We have our deficiencies like everybody does. Our institutions have deficiencies like all institutions do. But I would ask this, where in American life Is there more of a concerted effort to be thoughtful with respect to all of the social issues that we're talking about?
Mhm.
The universities, and therefore we need to protect that.
I think we've got time for one last question from the audience. I'm actually going to combine two. And this would give you an opportunity, especially based on your prior scholarship, to address the concern, this probably coming from the conservative side, that the use, for example, now in university hiring, especially faculty hiring, to require applicants to have diversity statements, to require departments or units to assess the commitment to diversity of an applicant, that does treat, it's the all, you know the story, right? It's the longstanding concern about reverse discrimination or identity thinking rather than treating each applicant fairly on their own merits or abilities. So what is your response to that kind of concern that might be raised? And as you mentioned earlier, might never be vocally, explicitly addressed by, to be perfectly honest, white people or white men in the university community or beyond, but it's a real concern. What's your response to that kind of issue?
I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned about that. Again, I think we have a massive, we live in a society that for a couple of centuries was a slave society, then superseded by a segregation society in large parts of the United States. We still live in a pigmentocracy. We do. And I think it's demonstrable. It's demonstrable with respect to all of the indicia of well-being. One can just, there's a hierarchy and there's a racial element to it. So it's a good thing that people are being attentive to that or trying to be attentive to that. But in trying to be attentive to it, we have to be careful. And, if I'm being looked at for, I don't care what I am, a historian, an anthropologist, a mathematician, and you're asking me about, this, that, and the other, maybe I haven't thought about it. Maybe I view it as very extrinsic to my intellectual, my scholarly mission. It seems to me, I'm concerned about that. And I think that these concerns need to be put on the table. I think we need to have true, candid talk. One thing I don't like, and I'm glad we've had this discussion. If we're going to talk, let's talk. There are too many instances in which people say, oh gosh, we don't talk enough. We don't talk about race enough. And then when people start talking, it's like, no, you can't say that. No, if we're going to talk, let's talk. And so, I don't know the ideological predisposition of the person to ask your question, but they're asking me. And I'm saying, yeah, I'm very concerned about that. I'd like to know a lot more about it. I would like to, if that's going to be the process, I want to be somebody's going to tell me a little bit more about why that's a good process. Somebody's going to have to tell me a little bit more about, are there downsides to that? They're going to have to assuage my anxieties because, like your questioner, I have anxiety about that.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you to Stanley James. I do have a few closing remarks here before final thanks. Thank you to all of us here tonight, joining in the conversation, all of you who joined us in the audience. This is our second webinar in a new series in the Civic Discourse Project on race, justice, and leadership in America. Check our website, please. That's scetl.asu.edu to see our upcoming webinar episodes in the series. Our next topic will be a discussion with two scholars about Frederick Douglass Danielle Allen of Harvard University, and Peter Myers of University of Wisconsin. And then our final session for this fall in November is a discussion on Lincoln and race with Lucas Morel of Washington and Lee. I should say a special thanks to tonight's co-sponsor for this webinar, the O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University, and the Dean, Doug Sylvester, and the instigator who helped me to think of this webinar, Professor James Weinstein of the law school. Then I have colleagues in the school itself to thank who make this webinar, this kind of webinar possible, and all our other programming. Dr. Carol McNamara, our Associate Director for Public Programs, Joe Martin, our Communications Manager, who has turned into our Zoom wizard in the past year, and Morgan Raddick of our events team. Thank you again to Vice Provost Stanley James of Arizona State University for joining me for the conversation with Randall Kennedy and to post questions to him. And of course, special thanks to our guest, Professor Randall Kennedy of Harvard Law School, for sharing his expertise and insights with us tonight. Thank you to everyone. Thank you, Randy. And we hope everyone is well. Thank you and good night.
Take care. Thank you.